And that's where Revelation 20 begins. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and the great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So Satan is bound. By the way, throughout our study of Revelation, we have met some amazingly powerful angels, haven't we? Remember way back when we were breaking open the seals, we saw that angel who was standing both in the ocean and on the shore. He was so vast in size that he could do that, right? And then we met an angel when we were talking about the trumpets who flung a censer from heaven onto earth in this judgment, a censer of fire. And then we met another angel who lit up the earth through his own glory. And we talked about, well, was that Jesus? No, this is an angel. It says so. And then last week we met an angel who stood in the sun. Fantastic vision. And here we meet another angel, an angel for whom the binding of Satan seems to be barely any difficulty whatsoever. He does it alone. I just love the beginning of verse 2. He sees the dragon. And when I read that, I have this image. There's this picture in my head of when I was 8 years old. We lived just down the street here off of Montgomery. And we lived across the street from a horse operation. They had a big barn, and they had a lot of feral cats in that barn. And those cats were no good. They were a pain all the time. Well, one day, my dad came out into the garage, and he sees a cat has climbed up in between the gas tank and the frame of the car. And he can see the tail dangling down below the bumper of the car. And my dad knows that if he drives with the cat up there, it's probably going to end up in the death of the cat. And so he doesn't want that to happen. So in his sensitivity, he goes and gets his leather work gloves, and then he proceeds to walk over, and he grabs that tail, and he gives it a yank. And that cat comes out of that car hissing and spitting and biting and clawing at that gloved hand. That's why he put on the gloves, right? He knew that was going to happen. And I just remember, this is the image that's still in my head to this day. I'll remember it until the day I die. My dad holds up this cat, hissing and spitting and clawing and biting at his hand with this bemused expression on his face, like, I just saved your life, you idiot. And then he proceeds to windmill that thing across the street back in the direction of the neighbor's barn. I have never seen a cat fly again to this day. But it was the most amazing thing that I have ever seen up to that point. And that's the image that I have here, right? This angel binding Satan and then just windmilling him into the pit with this bemused expression on his face. Like, what did you think you were going to do here? The pit, we said, and remember we looked at that back in chapter 9, is the holding place for the demonic horde. They were temporarily confined there, and then when the seals were broken open, the pit was opened up, and all of these demons pour out this smoke and all of that kind of stuff. And it was a horrific thing, a horrific event for the earth. And it has remained open until this moment. But now the pit will be sealed again as it holds Satan until his final judgment, when he'll be removed ultimately to the lake of fire, which Matthew 25 tells us was made for him to begin with. Come back next week for that. But why? Why the binding and holding and releasing and future judgment? Why not just get rid of him now? I mean, wouldn't that be the most expeditious way? And I've thought about that all week, and I've read lots of commentaries, and I think this is just a little bit of like a hypothesis. Like God is sort of proving a point. Do you remember back in Job, Satan is roaming the earth and he comes back to the throne room and God says, "Where have you been?" And he's like, "Well, I've been trying to see, who I might devour." He doesn't say it like that, but that's basically what he's doing. And God says, "Hey, have you considered my man Job?" And Satan says, he only loves you because you bless him. Take away your blessing, He'll curse your name. Just watch. Like, that's Satan's hypothesis, right? And of course, what we see ultimately is that Job does struggle with the fact that everything is taken away with him, but he ultimately learns that God is God and that he can praise him no matter what. And Satan is proven wrong. And I think here we've got kind of the reverse. This is the reverse of Satan's challenge. This is God saying, let's try removing you from the earth. All of your temptation, all of your lies, all of your deception. And let's take that all out of the equation and let's just see what happens on the earth. Now, it's not going to be permanent, but let's give it 1,000 years and see what happens. And the result is, as we've already seen from Isaiah, 1,000 years of peace. That's what we saw in all of those passages. There's only, there's no deception, right? There's nobody to lead people astray. There's nobody to give them an idea that might be counter or contrary to Christ's leading. Now, I say that with a little bit of trepidation because the human heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? But there is only one to rule, and that is Christ. So recall what we saw in Isaiah 11. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the lion, and the fatted calf together, and a little child shall lead them. Now there's two ways to interpret that last line. Either things will be so peaceful that it's a little child's priorities would be all that's needed in order to get through your day. That's one interpretation. Or you can take the other one, which is the one that I believe should be inferred. The little child is the Messiah, the Son of God, who leads perfectly. He's no longer a little child, obviously, but he came as a little child. And I think ultimately that's what we see here as we proceed then on into verse 4. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Now we're going to deal with the reigning in a little bit, but I feel like I need to pause here. We're going to need to do a little theological lesson. This may be a little dry. This is going to be a little bit of a TED Talk for about 5 minutes. Just bear with me. But we've now dealt with this word, the millennium, 3 times so far in this passage. And so we need to deal with that idea. What is the millennium that we keep talking about? What is this 1,000 years? Now, there are 3 predominant explanations for the millennium that come out of all of this. There is premillennialism, there is amillennialism, and there is postmillennialism. Pretty straightforward. And since we're in this passage already, let's just deal with all 3 of them so that we can know where I sit. You can decide for yourself. Now, I've been teaching from the premillennial perspective all the way through our study in Revelation. Some of you are well aware of that already. You've been trained. You've understood all of these terms. Some of you, this is a whole new term. So let me explain to you what that ultimately is. All that means, the premillennial perspective, is that Christ physically returns before, that's the pre, in the prefix of premillennial, before the 1,000-year period of peace. A premillennialist perspective takes Revelation 20 at face value. When Revelation 20 says 1,000 years 6 times, as it does, it seems like we're supposed to notice that. And we're not trying to spiritualize it or allegorize it or write it off completely as the other 2 perspectives attempt to do. So the premillennialist view states that right now, at this very moment where you are in the church, not in Revelation 20, but right now as you sit in this church right now, we are living in the church age, an indefinite period of time dominated by the Great Commission. Our purpose in being in the church age is to make disciples of Jesus. It's our responsibility. That's the role that Christ has given us, to make more disciples. But it also says that history and society, premillennialist view says that history and society are basically declining. They're descending into a time where Christ will eventually say, enough. which is kind of how I've been teaching it as we've gone through Revelation. And he will come back and actively rule the earth for 1,000 years, which is where we're at right now in Revelation 20. Hopefully all that sounds familiar to you. Amillennialism, just to move on, is the view, and these are very simplistic, so please don't assume that I'm giving you everything there is to know about these subjects. Amillennialism is the view that there is not a millennium at all. The prefix "a" means not. And so there is no 1,000-year reign at all. All of this stuff in the first 6 verses of chapter 20 is figurative language describing the church age, which I said we're already in right now. Jesus' ascension has already made him the King of Kings, and so his reign is being fulfilled right now with the church being present on earth. So the point of amillennialism is that we aren't waiting for something. The kingdom is here, and all that is left for the future is Christ joining us physically and bringing about the glorious end. Now, I'll say this. I believe, and amillennialists will, of course, debate me ad nauseum on this, I believe that there is no exegetical reason for this conclusion from the passage. It's purely an arbitrary act on the part of the interpreter based on his or her own presuppositions. After saying that nothing in Revelation can be taken on face value, which the amillennialists will tell you, it's all allegory, every bit of it, then we can interpret anything the way we want to because nobody really knows what Revelation actually means. Or at least maybe somebody knows, maybe Augustine knew because he was the first real amillennialist that wrote it all down. And honestly, I think that's the only way that you can get to amillennialism is to have some sort of presupposition about what it all means and what it's all for, and you base that on your own perspective of where you are at socially, politically in the world. And of course, Augustine wrote at a time in which the church was the preeminent leadership vehicle on earth. So of course he's going to say that it's already here. We don't want to be looking forward to something when the church is already in control. I'll just say that. The other predominant view is called post-millennialism. Post obviously means after. So Christ will return after the millennium, and it sounds like it's the opposite position from premillennialism, and in many ways it is. For instance, premillennialism teaches that the period right before Christ's return will be the worst in human history. Postmillennialism says right before Christ's return will be the best time in human history. What we don't know is when the millennium begins. That's the part that we're not sure about in terms of postmillennialism and when it ends, because we'll never really know exactly when that line was crossed, or when the church has reached its maximum potential and ushered in the millennial that we're working through ultimately to Christ's return. This was, by the way, the kind of the predominant theology for Christianity for a few hundred years. And it's only really since the mid-1800s that premillennialism has kind of reasserted itself in the world. Because as we went through the Industrial Revolution and we went through the scientific age, people looked at the world and they said, yes, things are ultimately getting better. Everything is getting better. Look at how much easier life is. Obviously, things are getting better. We must be ultimately working to that golden age in which everything is good. And then, of course, World War I came along, and then World War II came along, and then, all kinds of genocides happened. 100 million people were killed by starvation in China, and Pol Pot killed 20 million people in Southeast Asia, and Stalin killed who knows how many million. We can't even find a record that gives us an accurate count of what Stalin killed in Russia, and suddenly everybody went, are things really getting better? Because it feels like they're getting worse. And so, because of that, through the 20th century, you saw premillennialism become basically the established position really through North America, although huge segments of the church still believe in postmillennialism and amillennialism. So anyway, all that to say. So the blessed future in the postmillennialist that the postmillennialist is looking to, that golden area of the church, is brought about through the activity of the church, through the active efforts of the church, ultimately to set all things right. That's their perspective on the millennium. Now, if you heard when I said that we, the church, establish the golden age of humanity on earth, you got that kind of right, because that's ultimately what it comes down to, is how is it established? Well, Jesus isn't physically here, so he's working through the church, and the church is the one that is ultimately responsible for bringing about that golden age. Then, when it's time for final judgment, Jesus physically comes back, which I don't, that's the part where I get a little bit fuzzy on, is like, why does Jesus even come back in postmillennialism? I don't know why he would. If it's already the golden age and the church is already ruling the earth, why does he even need to be coming back? It's a little bit of a loss to me, but I confess, I come in with my own presuppositions of premillennialism. So take that for what it is. You can go research it. You can figure this out. This isn't supposed to be a thorough talk. So I guess he has to come back because he said he would. Great, so he's going to come back. But that's from John chapter 14, and postmillennialism makes the whole rest of his statement a useless phrase. He's going to prepare a place for us. Well, who cares? Everything's perfect on earth by the time he comes back. I don't know. So anyway, that's postmillennialism. The 1,000 years is in postmillennialism is meh. It doesn't really. It's a fungible number. It could be 1,000, but I read one author that said it could be anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000 years. We don't know. We can just extend out the time because right now we're seeing things get worse. So therefore, we just extend out the time and say, well, the church isn't there yet. Obviously, this is too soon, and so we just need more time, and then the church will become preeminent on the earth. It's possible. I'm not going to say it's not possible. I'm just saying it's unlikely. Now, I've said multiple times as we've been going through Revelation that we should take the literal sense if it makes common sense. Otherwise, every other sense that we might take could be nonsense, and it could be in this case. In this case, why take 1,000 years literally? I mean, why do that? Amillennialism says there is no 1,000 years. Postmillennialism says it's indefinite. It could be any length of time. So why take 1,000 years literally? Well, why not? Is my answer to that. Why would John use 1,000 years here in this passage 6 times? Verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, and verse 7, which we won't get to today. 6 times if it's some other indeterminate time standard. Why? Seems like a stretch. We don't see that in any other passage. When we look at things where we see the number repeated multiple times, say 40 years in the wilderness for the Israelites, it literally means 40 years. And if we see 400 years of their bondage and slavery, it literally means 400 years. So why when we see it repeated so many times, would it not mean that 1,000 years here? So what happens then when you make it say something else? When you make it say something that you ultimately have to stand on your head in order to make sense of it, what happens then? If the literal sense of 1,000 years is rejected, who gets to decide what it ultimately means? If the literal sense isn't reality, isn't what it literally means, then what does it mean? And who decides what it does mean? I mean, what's to stop 12,000 different churches from having 12,000 different opinions about what this 1,000 years really means, what the implications are for us? If you take away the literal interpretation, then you can really literally make Scripture say anything you want it to say, which is, of course, the issue with every cult on earth. And many have throughout history. So, not to mention the fact that when we spiritualize everything, it leads to some glaring inconsistencies in terms of our interpretation. For instance, of these 3 views, all of them suggest that the great white throne judgment will literally happen, but not this 1,000 years of imprisonment of Satan. Not really sure why the great white throne judgment is taken literally, but the kingdom is not, and how it's proposed here is not taken literally, it's taken figuratively. Why is the new heavens and the new earth that we'll come to as we progress through chapter 21 and into chapter 22. Why is that taken literally when the binding of Satan in this passage and the banishment to the abyss is not? I don't know. There's some glaring inconsistencies to me in terms of how we interpret Revelation. And that's all. I'm just trying to bring that out. So TED Talk over. If we're in the kingdom right now, just as one last statement, if we're in the kingdom right now, as the all-millennialist suggests, I got to say, it's a bit disappointing. Final barb. Okay, so as I've been saying from day one of this study, the whole purpose of Revelation is to provide hope to the church. So at no point do we get this sense in Revelation that the church is to provide its own hope. And the hope is this: no matter how bad it gets, Jesus will come back to earth, literally, physically, and he will set up his kingdom, and he'll reign for 1,000 years. And there will be 1,000 years of peace and 1,000 years of justice.